Thank you very much, uh, Professor Mishra, Professor Chaube, Rahul, and all the wonderful teachers and students of Banaras Hindu University. It's my honor and privilege to be here, standing here with a great deal of trepidation because for a very important reason. Jail Mehta represented the finest kind of intellect in India, and as Professor Anand Mishra said, much like J.L. Mohanty, he's perhaps one of the rare philosophers of India who gets recognized internationally as an equal philosopher. And rightly so, his contribution on Heidegger is considered to be one of the best introductions to Heidegger globally. My own reading of Mehta is very limited, primarily to his writings on religion, and also my own training, as is evident from my brief, as was given by Rahul, is mainly in analytical philosophy, and therefore it's not just my ignorance, but also a certain kind of a snobbery that we had against the continental thinking, and therefore it's interesting that I get the opportunity to deliver the inaugural lecture on culture and civilization on Professor, which is instituted in the name of J.L. Mehta. Also, it's interesting that Heidegger, the muse of J.L. Mehta, also represents continental philosophy, and there is a huge amount of issue regarding continental philosophy with reference to feminist consciousness and women's movement globally. What I would want to do in the course of my interaction with you is actually I had two very long papers which I had thought that on which I thought that we should deliberate, especially with reference to culture and civilization, and which deal with questions which are related, one, to multiculturalism, two, to the question of feminism, three, to the question of the engagement of multiculturalism and feminism, and then to the larger question, the fourth question, is that do feminism and multiculturalism make a correct kind of attack on philosophy in general, and analytical philosophy in particular, also continental philosophy, which shares with analytical philosophy the same kind of global foundational thinking. So I have this proposal that you will have to bear with me. And what I thought was that, can I just ask a few things? How many of you are familiar with the feminist debates? And do you all, are you familiar with the questions of feminism and its questions to philosophy? Do you teach feminism as a part of your papers? No. Okay. So what I'll do is that I think for simplicity's sake, I'll try and do two things. Because what I'm trying to do in this paper is to look at gender justice, standpoint theory, and universalistic hopes. But all these questions are actually part of a broader debate, which is actually a debate regarding the question about what is the nature of philosophy and why is it that philosophy, because as the series is called, Culture and Civilization, generally there is a standard view which says that philosophy is actually an a priori foundational discipline which does not get impacted by culture and civilization. And therefore, we are talking about, like, say, for instance, there was one young boy who's now trying to work on Isha Upanishad and the commentary of Shankaracharya. Now, the first and the short Upanishad, which talks about Ishavasya Sarvam, cannot be called a doctrine of a civilization or a culture. It is actually a kind of a foundational understanding of how the universe is constituted. So, is it constituted so only for the people in India? And and this is, in fact, has a very strong kind of a contemporary ring also, because right now a lot of debate is going on about Indian civilization, Indological studies, etc., etc. And then we have a great deal of difficulty, especially with the kinds of departments like you have in BHU, where you have a department which is called the Department of Philosophy and Comparative Religion, because the way to study religion and the way to study philosophy may not entirely cohere with each other. So what I'll do is that initially I'll just take a few things and then weave it together. One is that as a philosopher trained especially in analysis, and also as was expressed in my, as an activist involved with many areas of women's movement, from theoretical understanding to training to advocacy, planning and sensitization, I find that there is much need for deliberation on the questions of feminism, on the questions of gender justice, on the question of standpoint theory, which is again a very, very important theoretical framework, and the question of universal hopes. Because more and more people are now talking about cultural specificity and coming from all sorts of quarters. Now, feminism, as we all know, can be seen in multiple ways. It can be seen as a historically originated term in social science. And you would be surprised to know that if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary of 1901, they don't make a distinction between feminine and feminist. So while we always think that we need to make a very important distinction between female, feminine, and feminist. Female is a certain kind of a category which actually becomes located in the biology of the human being. And feminine is a set of characteristics which we associate depending upon the social political space where we are. And feminist is a certain kind of a political stance that we take when we talk about justice, equality, equity, and also difference. So, but it's curious that till 1901, people did not make a distinction between, and therefore feminist has to be understood in a very interesting way, that it is a historically originated term which comes, and it's a term primarily which comes in social sciences. And it is also an analytic category to understanding social structures, or it could be both a historical as well as an analytic category. Now, let me quickly run through some framework questions of, like say, for instance, who are the feminists? I think all of us are feminists. Is it true? No. No? Who is not a feminist here? Hmm? Yeah. So in one way, anybody who recognizes that there is discrimination against women as a class is a feminist, number one. Number two, anybody who thinks that actually it is actually part of the social history, and anybody who thinks that we are all committed to change that is a feminist. So on that, I think, will you join? Peculiar men-hating creatures. Feminists are those who understand the fact that there is a discrimination in society on women as a class. Men are discriminated. Men are discriminated. Poor men are discriminated by rich men. Upper caste, lower caste men are discriminated by upper caste men and women both. The colored people are so men are also discriminated. But men are not discriminated as a class. Women are discriminated as a class, as being a membership. So apart from the other distinctions, they are discriminated as a class, number one. Number two, that this is historical, socially constructed. Number three, we are all committed to change that. So that's what makes us all feminists. So I'm very happy that BHU turns feminists. Then what are the kinds of questions that the feminists are asking? We'll quickly say that there are three questions that they're asking. The first question that they're asking, that what causes the subjugation, oppression, and humiliation of women? And for that, there will be different answers. Some people, for a very long time, continue to say that it is biology, that why women are subjugated. Some people said it is because of culture. Some people said that it's because of both. Some people said that it's because of capital or private property, and so on and so forth. The different kinds of answers are given to the first question. पूछते हैं, से भी सब पूछते बार बार कि भाई आपकी कोई तो बात होगी, आपको बार बार क्यों आके कभी तुर्क ने मार के चले गए, फिर डच मार के चले गए, फिर पोर्चुगीज मार के चले गए, फिर उसके बाद फिर अंग्रेज मार के चले गए, फिर अब आपको अमेरिकन मार रहे हैं. So there must be something wrong with you. So why is it that women as a class are humiliated everywhere? So everybody wants to have an answer. Just as they say that why are the people so colonized and so on. So and then you have to have answers. So the first question that you want to answer is that what is the reason for it? The second is that what is the kind of world that you want? Do you want a world wherein there is no distinction between men and women and everybody is the same? That's one ideal. The second is that no, we do not want that all men and women must be alike. We want different but equal. So men are not women and women are not men, but we want equal treatment. The third is, again, which has come more so, and I think for all philosophy students know it better than the rest, which has come more into focus because of the ethics of care. Carol Gilligan and the others, and they are saying कि आपने इतने ज़माने तक you had actually given the male idea of justice and fairness and objectivity and passed it that that is the objective idea, and that you had said that women are emotional and caring and loving, which is a feminine nature, and we should actually keep it out of the public sphere. And you will find that very clearly done in case of Rousseau, that the realm of the private is actually the realm of the love and care. Women are not capable of justice, as also Kant would say, and because the justice is the realm of impartiality, women can't be impartial. They are so loving and caring. Now, this kind of theorization said that care is opposed to justice. Loving and compassion is opposed to impartiality. Now, a third view is saying that what we have done so far in this world is that in the name of impartiality, in the name of justice, we have actually represented a certain kind of a cold power model of public life, wherein the men have taken the idea of control and power, and they control other men, they control women, they control children, they control nature, and they draw everything out of it for their own purposes. So Veerbhogya Vasundhara types. So that is the kind of thing which is problematic. And therefore, why can't we actually now develop a world which is feminine? Because this feminine world of care, love, and will be a world which is better for women, which is better for children, and which is also better for nature and men. So the third ideal is that we should actually, instead of having the sexless world or men and women being equal, why can't we really make a caring world, which would be, in one sense, feminine? The third question which they are asking is, how do we get there? So once we have found out what the reasons for women's subordination are, second, we have decided what is the kind of world that we want to have, then the third question would be, how do we get there? So this is the kind of three sets of questions that they're asking. And we know that these questions are differently answered by different people. One taxonomy is that we take the first wave, second wave, third wave feminism. So the first wave feminism is supposed to be saying that we are all interested in equality. The second wave feminism is saying that no, equality is not enough. We are actually talking about equity, that we want participation. And the third wave feminism is saying that actually what we need to also cognize is the fact of difference. So the black slave woman, because you know that is what you find. आप लोग सब आज भी अगर if I say कि एक पोस्टर बनाइए women empowerment, तो सब कहेंगे अब तो कल्पना चावला आ गई है, अब तो औरतें बाहर आ गई है, etc. etc. Now जो औरत सड़क पे झाड़ू लगा रही है और जो खेतों में खेत कर रही है, जो रोज मजदूर जा रही है, वो तो कह रही है मैं तो रोज ही बाहर जा रही थी. आप अब अपने घर से निकली हैं, मैं तो रोज ही जा रही थी और आपके घर में भी काम कर रही थी, उसके घर में भी काम कर रही थी, उसके पीठ पे. So you are not taking us to be persons at all. So the black women were saying that this is actually a white middle class women's movement, which is saying that coming out of the home is actually woman empowerment. For many of us, many of the poor women, many of the black women, sitting at home was supposed to be one great luxury, which they would never have because of their poverty and their difficulty. So the question is that what is it that you would like to say in terms of differences? So the Brahmin woman in a particular village, the Kshatriya woman in a particular village, like the Kathavachak women in, say for instance, in Tamil Nadu, had a certain kind of predicament which is described by in certain papers कि जब लोगों ने सबने अपने घर के अंदर अंदर they started, अब सत्यनारायण की कथा कोई जना पंडित को बुलाता नहीं, वो अपने खुद ही कर लेते हैं या अपने टेप रिकॉर्डर के ऊपर 4 फूल रख के अपनी पूजा कर लेते हैं. So the कथावाचक has no job. Now when the Kathavachak has no job, but since he's a Kathavachak Brahmin, he can't also go and work in the field of the other person. So the poor women had to do certain things. But since they were Brahmin women, they were not allowed to go out. So it also works backwards. So we found that different women in different places have different kind of things, and that is being emphasized by the third wave feminism. This is one taxonomy, which is the time frame taxonomy 1, 2, 3. The other framework of looking at feminist theory is actually in terms of theoretical frameworks. That one, liberal feminism, 2, radical feminism, 3, Marxist feminism, 4th, existential feminists, 5th, psychoanalytical feminists, then postmodern feminists. Now, all of these, as you know, since you're all students of philosophy, you know that all of them are actually reflective of the counterpart philosophical theory. So liberal feminists are those who believe in liberal theory, which is the theory, so Mary Walter Sharp, John Stuart Mill and the others, the importance of reason and equal distribution. The radical feminists are those feminists which are who are talking about the fact that don't be so innocent. आप ये मानते हैं कि सब लड़कियों को पढ़ाने भेज देंगे, सब लड़कियों को नौकरी करने भेज देंगे, सब लड़कियों को बाजार में जोखिम करना भेज देंगे, तो सब और कुछ करने की जरूरत पड़ेगी. But you are wrong. ऐसा होगा नहीं. आदमी नियत से ही इतना क्रूर और खराब है कि वो नोच के लोगों को दबाता रहता है, और उसकी जो नोचने की प्रवृत्ति है, जब तक उस प्रवृत्ति के ऊपर आघात नहीं किया जाएगा, तो वो प्रकृति का दोहन जैसे करता है वैसा ही वो स्त्री का दोहन करता रहेगा, वैसा ही वो अन्यों का दोहन करता रहेगा. इसलिए मदरहुड का इंस्टीट्यूशन की आपने औरतों को कह दिया वो माँ है, वो महान है, और सर सैयद ने कहा माओ बहनों बेटियों, विवेकानंद ने कहा माँ सबसे बड़ी होती है, गांधी जी ने कहा माँ सबसे बड़ी होती है. बट देयर अगेन यू आर essentializing women into the role of motherhood, and you are actually saying that you are important because you are a mother. Now, if a woman doesn't want to be a mother, a woman can't be a mother, or a woman says that I am actually not only a mother but also a human being. So what about that woman? So this kind of a trouble exists, and therefore the glorification of motherhood, and on the other hand, the big industry of pornography. These are the two kinds of things which become a central object for the radical feminists to see, that on the one hand, you commodify the woman's body in terms of making her an object of pornography, and on the other hand, you glorify the body of the woman by essentially making her a mother. And that becomes, again, a philosophical theory, which is a feminist theory, which has a huge amount of discussion. The radical feminists, as they call it. The Marxist feminists, as you know, again, based upon the Marxist theory. And again, the difficulty is that बहुत ही कम लोग हैं जो मार्क्स को पढ़ते हैं, और बहुत ही कम लोग हैं जो मार्क्सवादी हैं, वो तो और भी कम पढ़ते हैं. तो उसमें सबसे बड़ी मुश्किल ये थी कि if you read Marx, then you find, does Marx have a theory of justice? It's very interesting to see that Marx rarely talks about justice. And in many cases, he said that I do not want to talk about justice because there can be alternative theories of justice. I don't want to get into the argument. Just as exactly the way in which Ambedkar says, I do not want to go into philosophy of religion. I'm not interested in argument. I'm actually directly interested in headlong the transformation of society. But nonetheless, one of the things with the Marxist theory, especially coming from Engels and Marx's work, is that private property is the reason for women's subjugation. And if private property were to be eliminated, then things would be all right. Also, the other thing is that when Marx says that in the industrial society, women have been reduced from the producer to only a reproducer. क्योंकि आप जैसे देखते हैं, for instance, you are in Varanasi. I don't know about Varanasi in particular, but in many cases, say for instance in Lucknow and Barabanki and also in Chanderi, the weaving community which weaves cloth, in that both men and women are weavers. And तो औरतें भी बुनती हैं, और यहाँ औरतें बुनती नहीं है, शायद बहुत कम बुनती हैं, लेकिन चंदेरी में बुनती हैं और बाराबंकी में भी दरहरा वगैरह में बुनती हैं. तो उनका ये कहना था कि प्री इंडस्ट्रियल इकोनॉमी में जब घरेलू उद्योग था तो आदमी औरत दोनों मिलके काम करते थे, और आदमी का सिर्फ फर्क होता था कि आदमी उस सामान को ले जाके बेचता था, लेकिन प्रोडक्शन दोनों करते थे. जब इंडस्ट्रियल सोसाइटी बन गई तो ये हो गया कि कलकत्ते, बंबई और बड़ी बड़ी शहरों के अंतर्गत इंडस्ट्री लग गई और आदमी अपना घर छोड़ के वहां पर जाकर प्रोड्यूसर बन गया, और घर में रहने वाली औरत फिर केवल रिप्रोड्यूसर बन गई, क्योंकि वो फैक्ट्री के लिए मजदूर को पैदा कर रही है और उसको स्वस्थ रख रही है, ताकि फैक्ट्री ओनर को बना बनाया मजदूर मिल जाए, खाया पिया, जिसके कि खाने पीने के ऊपर उसको खर्चा ना करना पड़े. सो द women's role as a producer has been replaced by a woman's role primarily as a reproducer. This was the Marxist theory, and therefore there is a critique of private property and industrialization primarily, and that is what they see as the source of greater oppression of women. And they also say that, industrialization is better than the feudal state, but nonetheless, it creates its own difficulties. The other position is the existential theory, which you all know, that in existentialism, you have seen two strands, the religious strand and the non-religious strand. And the existential feminists are saying that women can create themselves. It is possible, just as so existence precedes essence, and therefore women, despite the fact that they might have had a certain kind of a historical, cultural framework in the Marxist theory, but yet it is possible for them to transform that. Then you come to the psychoanalytical feminists, and in that you know that psychoanalytical framework was provided to us by one of the favorites of Professor J.L. Mehta. He was very impressed by Freud. So Freud says that anatomy determines destiny, and therefore women have the kind of life that they have because they have a particular kind of a body, and in that particularly they are the principal child bearers, and they are also the principal child rearers, and therefore their confinement to home takes them away from the productive sphere for a certain kind, and therefore women are suffering the kind of thing that they are. This was the early Freudian thing, but then there are other psychoanalytical theorists like Nancy Chodorov and the others who talk about certain other things. One of the things that they are talking about is the question of permeable ego boundaries and non-permeable ego boundaries. A permeable ego boundary is that they say that women generally consider themselves primarily in terms of their relationships. So I am a good mother, I'm a good daughter, I'm a good sister, I'm a good lover, I'm a good chachi, I'm a good phupi, I'm a good etc etc etc. So it's their own, all identities primarily. And I keep on saying that, even if you look at literature, Varanasi people, I think, know it better than all of us, that if you look at all Hindi literature and the others, how are Naikas defined? The Naika is defined Khandita Naika, Poshita Naika, Manini Naika, Vipralabdha Naika. So the woman's identity is completely determined in the way she's being treated by the man. There is no Vipralabdha Nayak, there is no Khandit Nayak, there is no Manini Nayak. The Nayak is Dhiroddat and Dhirlalit. So the agentile character of the man is recognized not only in social theory, but even in critical examination of literature. So not only do you have a gender bias in poetry, you have a gender bias in literary criticism. So these are the kinds of things which come when you look at psychoanalytical theory and you say that, women have permeable ego boundaries, and they are so permeable that there is no space left for them. And I think all of you are young people. You should read a lot of literature and also see a lot of cinema. There's a letter which I think a small story which is called Stri Patro by Rabindranath. And you should all read. With that there's Vinodini, and then it's a beautiful little story about a woman, and it's a very interesting story because it is written in such a ordinary way that you are surprised that it has such an extraordinary content. The story is of a woman who lives in a house, and she is living in a bourgeois house, and very well respected. She wants to have a child, doesn't have a child. There is her Jeth and Jethani, and they're all living there, and very well respected and loving. There is another young girl in the house who gets married, and who then has a terrible time in the in-laws' house. She is not related to this woman, wo uski jethani ki rishtedar hai. And then when she comes back, she says कि ये तो मेरी लड़की के बराबर है, इसको मैं रख लेती हूँ घर में. तुम इसको नहीं रख सकती. उन्होंने कहा मैं इसको गाय के जहाँ पे भूसे का ढेर रखे वहां रख लेती हूँ. वो उनको वहां भी नहीं रखने की इजाजत देते. And that is the time when this girl realizes कि ये जो मुझे सोने की माला और साड़ी और सम्मान मिल रहा था, ये सब तो ठीक था, लेकिन when it came to a decision about this little girl and saving her, I have no position in the house. So she leaves the Bhabhi, Mama, and then there's a photographer who comes and he said, "What's your name?" And I must share this experience myself, that I remember when I was teaching in one of the houses in Lucknow in an adult literacy program. This was Amritlal Nagar's house, and I used to go there after my university at 2 o'clock, and then be there for 2 hours and teach some children and women and the others, trying to bring in some kind of social consciousness. And I remember one girl did not come, and 20-25 दिन तक नहीं आई, फिर आई वो. And then she came back and she suddenly said, "Bhaiya, bhaiya." I said, "Mera naam Saraswati hai." I said, "Okay." So I was surprised that why is she saying that. She said, no, Ramavati. She said that, आपने मेरा नाम पूछा था, पर मेरी 8 साल की उम्र में शादी हो गई थी, तब से सब लोग मुझे रमेश की बहू कहते थे. उसके बाद बच्चे हो गए तो फलाने की अम्मा कहते थे. तो आई हैड फॉरगॉटन माय नेम. आपने जब मेरा नाम पूछा तो मैं वापस घर गई, एंड आई आस्क्ड माय फादर कि मेरा नाम क्या है. And if you look at the UN Charter, the Child Rights Charter, the first right of the child is right to a name and nationality. So the denial of women's own names. So Nancy Shodorov is talking about this denial of subjecthood and permeable ego boundaries. And she said that, that's the kind of issue. So psychoanalytical feminism, lots of talk. Then there is this question of postmodern feminism, which talks about women are not a monolith. Every woman is not a feminist. There are multiple voices, and each one of them needs to be legitimately looked at. So this is one taxonomy. So one is a timeline, first wave, second wave, third wave. Second is based upon ideological framework. And there's also a third taxonomy, which is based upon sometimes geographical region. So you say the Afro-American feminists. So particularly the black women who are in America. And then you also talk about the Southeast Asian feminism. क्योंकि कई बार यहाँ पर हिंदुस्तान में ये बात होती है कि अंग्रेजी बोलने वाली बाल कटी औरतों का मूवमेंट है फेमिनिज्म. तो उनको ये बताना बहुत जरूरी होता है कि हिंदुस्तान और पाकिस्तान में खासतौर से जो मूवमेंट हमारा फेमिनिस्ट मूवमेंट चला और वुमेन्स मूवमेंट चला पिछले खासतौर से 70 साल में, वो सबसे गरीब औरतों का था और ज्यादातर अनपढ़ और दलित औरतें थी. तो चाहे वो चिपको आंदोलन में थी, जो गौरा देवी वगैरह जो पेड़ों को बचा रही थी, चाहे वो नर्मदा बचाओ आंदोलन में थी, चाहे वो एंटी अरक मूवमेंट था कर्नाटक में जिनमें शराब की भट्टियां तोड़ रही थी, वो सबसे गरीब औरतें थी, ज्यादातर अनपढ़ और ज्यादातर दलित. तो ये कोई पढ़ी लिखी उनके बारे में पढ़ी लिखी औरतों ने बात करी या उनके साथ पढ़ी लिखी औरतें खड़ी हो गई, ये एक अलग सवाल है. और लाइमलाइट में हो सकता है अखबार वालों ने उनकी जगह उन औरतों से सवाल करा, दैट्स अनदर स्टोरी. बट अगेन, सो साउथ ईस्ट एशियन women feminism, the feminist movement in of the black women. So it's also sometimes divided in giving. All of that is that all these kind of distinctions sometimes seem very peculiar in philosophy, because in philosophy we never do this. Sometimes we talk about German idealism. Sometimes we talk about continental philosophy. And again, we all know that continental philosophy is such a bad title. It's such a bad misnomer. क्योंकि जो सबसे क्योंकि हम लोग क्या अपोज करते हैं, कॉन्टिनेंटल फिलॉसफी और एनालिटिकल फिलॉसफी. एनालिटिकल फिलॉसफी किसने बनाई थी? फ्रेगे ने. फ्रेगे कौन था? जर्मन. उससे पहले उनका सबसे बड़ा बाप कौन था? कांट. वो कौन था? ऑस्ट्रियन. सारे बाकी जितने भी ये लोग थे, ये सारे के सारे ऑल अनलेस अगर वहां पे हिटलर ना आया होता तो ये सबके सब जर्मनी में तो रह रहे थे. They had to flee from there and then move. Many of them went to Oxford. और जब वो ऑक्सफोर्ड में गए तब उनका कोई कॉमन एजेंडा भी नहीं था. So the divide between analytical and non-analytical is not actually a geographical divide at all. So it's not the continental versus the versus the Anglo-American philosophy, as it was called. It's an absolute falsehood. So also here we look at different feminist taxonomies, and some ideas have cultural, contextual, and significance of some of the foundational. Now, what I want to say is that this has some implications, and the questions are that how does philosophy, which is an a priori discipline, which is an analytical discipline, engage with these kind of things? And many times the feminists raise 2 or 3 kinds of questions against philosophy. One, they say that philosophers all over the world have said very unkind things about women. So beginning from Plato and Aristotle to Kant to even Wittgenstein, I think with very few notable exceptions like John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, and Russell, I think almost all philosophers have said absolutely horrible, unacceptable things about women. And I don't know, much similarly, maybe if you look at the Indian philosophical system, maybe you may find certain things. I am not referring to that. I leave Dr. Mishra to explore and tell us about that. But that's one. The other view is that philosophy privileges reason, and thereby the very nature of philosophy is gender biased. Because you are talking about a priori, foundational, rational inquiry, thereby structurally you are eliminating emotion, and you are saying women are emotional, and therefore you are relegating women from that. So that's the second view. Now, these kinds of things are there, and in 16th and 17th century, much of the political practice in Europe and England, and a lot of political thought laid also emphasis on the sovereign power of the state as a factor independent of social life, and in principle not restrained. So they were talking about an unrestrained society. It's only that after John Locke that you find that the individual becomes primary. You know, this is one distinction which I think is a convenient distinction which can be debated, but nonetheless, this is a distinction which sometimes we made. Society is made for human beings. But before the 17th century, the idea was that society and state are meant for the convenience of individuals. But if there is a conflict between society, state, and the individual, we will stand with the state. It is only after the 17th century that this becomes the question that no, if there would be a conflict between the society and the state and the individual, we'll stand by the individual. And this kind of a thing is generally coming from John Locke, where the primacy of individual freedom was asserted. The suffrage rights, the legal equality with other safeguards of protection were institutionally demanded. And towards the end of the Middle Ages, the concept of sovereign state and individualism became central to the debate. But this is something very, very, very interesting. कि जब ये debate हो भी रहा था, तब भी of all the groups, and this is what I am quoting, of all the groups excluded from full citizenship, none was more stubbornly barred than women. This is written by Susan Mendes and Ellen Kennedy. Nor were philosophical arguments for exclusion from vote from legal equality so patently self-contradictory and archaic in any other case. In almost all respects, the theories of Adam Smith and Hegel, of Kant and Mill, of Rousseau and Nietzsche are poles apart. But in their treatment of women, these otherwise diverse philosophers present a surprisingly united front, the assumption that women's biological nature dictates and justifies her lack of political status, the belief that women's psychological nature is gentle, submissive, emotional, irrational. The insistence on confining women to the hearth and the home, the assertion that women are suited for rearing citizens but not for being citizens themselves, all these views are adopted by all these philosophers. And it is interesting that some scholars maintain, and this I think again is very interesting. Some people say कि public or private का distinction पुरानी society में था ही नहीं. But if you look at Plato, you see that Plato does principally make a distinction between the oikia and the polis. And the modern conception and the liberal political institutions aimed at securing an arena of political and economic activity from regulation, and is thus freed private individuals from the constraint and fundamental duties by absolute states. So जिस जमाने में लोग बाग प्राइवेट को अलग करते थे, अभी आप देखते होंगे कि फेमिनिस्ट मूवमेंट का एक बहुत बड़ा स्लोगन है, द पर्सनल इज द पॉलिटिकल. पर और पर जब ओरिजिनली लोगों ने प्राइवेट रेल्म को अलग करने की कोशिश की थी, तो उसका रीजन ये था कि दे डिड नॉट वांट अ टोटलिटेरियन स्टेट टू एक्चुअली impinge upon every aspect of your society. So now as feminists we have a double task. One, we want to say that the personal is the political, that what is happening to me in my home is also subject to public scrutiny and public debate. On the other hand, I'm also asking for a personal space as a woman, what Virginia Woolf calls a room of one's own. So you're on the one hand wanting to claim privacy, and on the other hand you are also wanting that no part of this private domain is actually left out of public moral scrutiny. And that is the interesting kind of a debate which happens regarding the public and the private within the realm of social theory and political theory. But but did the divide between the private and the public help women? Two reasons realm of morality were created, and this is in fact very interesting. This is from Rousseau. The sweet, the gentle, and the amiable. This is the domestic realm. Sweet, gentle, and amiable. And the public is the great, the awful, and the respectable. So when Rousseau is saying कि लड़कियों को, जब एमील और सोफी की एजुकेशन के लिए वो दो अलग अलग रेल्म बताते हैं कि एमील को तो बाहर पब्लिक रेल्म के लिए पढ़ाओ और सोफी को डायनल कोर्स ऑफ नेचर, तो एक तरह से कोई भेदभाव करके किसी को पीछे नहीं छोड़ने की बात कर रहे हैं, wanting to say that let the woman remain in the sweet and the gentle and the amiable and not go into the great and the awful, though it is respectable. So he's not necessarily a villain, but yet he creates the two world theory, and he creates a world in which women are denied the education to become a fellow participant in the great, awful, and the respectful. And these were interpreted as male and female. Virtue was relocated within the family. Education and virtues were necessary for aspiring citizens, but educators were considered unworthy of citizenship. तो वो आप देखते ही हैं कि ये बात कही जाएगी कि नहीं, माँ पहली शिक्षक होती है, माँ आपको सिटीजनशिप वैल्यू देगी, ये सब कह रहे हैं, लेकिन माँ सिटीजन नहीं होती. And this is very interesting. Some studies have happened because, you know, if you look at India's freedom movement also, आप कोई भी डॉक्यूमेंट्री देखिए, गांधी जी के पीछे हजारों औरतें, हजारों औरतें. After India gains independence, where are those women? In your own memory, उत्तरांचल के जब उत्तराखंड बना, thousands and thousands of women, it was largely a women's movement. When it came to power, again, Surjit Singh Barnala, Narendra Tiwari and the others, where are the women? Once you gain independence, you say कि नहीं, अब तुम घर जाओ. So this whole question, man occupies both the public and the private role, while woman is confined to the private, and Rousseau elevated the private above the public. And this is interesting. What I'm saying is that Rousseau is not necessarily a villain. He is not seeing it as a kind of a discrimination. He's actually seeing it as a privilege. Rousseau elevated the private above the public and lauded the integration of the domestic life as against the fragmentation of the public existence. तो अभी कहते हैं ना कि बाहर की दुनिया में इतना लड़ाई है, इतना झगड़ा है, बॉस मारता है, चिल्लाता है, डांटता है, तुम तो कम से कम घर में बैठी हुई हो. So that's the kind of an idea. Nietzsche considers public to be supreme importance, where women are a threat. And this is, I think, very interesting. Nietzsche considers public to be a supreme importance, where women are a threat, as they are interested in persons and their personalized way of loving and hating. Taking sides is a barrier to being just. For Hegel, again, rule by arbitrary inclination and opinion is wrong. And Schlegel went on to say, love is a woman's calling. She is unable to experience it as a partial interest. And Kant too claims men must rule and women must rein them in. And as I mentioned, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are perhaps the only two notable exceptions. Kant, who again happens to be one of my very favorite philosophers, I read him for the past 35, 40 years. but he disappointed me hugely when I read his views on women. His views on women are really embarrassing, as rightly pointed by Susan Mendes. In the groundwork for metaphysics of morals, he emphasizes that moral principles must apply to all rational beings. But then he denies active citizenship to women, which he also denied to unpropertied members. ये क्योंकि अरिस्टोटल में भी था, उन्होंने कहा कि औरतों में रीजन की कैपेसिटी तो है, लेकिन चिल्ड्रन और स्लेव्स की तरह दे आर नॉट देयर ओन मास्टर्स, सो दे कैन नॉट बी देयर. But Kant is worse. Kant is saying freedom of every member of society as a human being. This is important. Number two, equality of each with all others as a subject is important. Independence of each member of the Commonwealth as a citizen is important. But when you look at his book, a small book called Theory and Practice, he says, these laws establish the state, but not all have a hand in framing the law. Passive citizens are only auxiliaries without civil independence, and they must take orders from others. Servants of merchants are passive citizens, and so are women. Interestingly, passive citizens like apprentices and domestic citizenship can better themselves, and they can become active when they earn property. And they can become their own masters. Slave ne bhi apna kaam kara, paisa ikkatha kara kar liya. But in theory and practice, he maintains that being an adult male is essential. This is not allowed. And that being an adult male is essential, so women are excluded essentially, almost declared incapable of independence. And this, I think, is very disappointing. Although, again, we do not give up on Kant, because as feminists, we use Kant enormously in our women's movement and our women's struggle. Primarily, that argument which all of you have read in your BA ethics courses, treat everybody as an end in himself and not as a means to an end. That, I think, is very useful for us as in all struggles for people who are marginalized, in this case, women. So we don't give up on Kant, we also don't give up on Aristotle, but we recognize that actually as individual philosophers, they did have certain views which need to be examined. In marriage, again, this is a very interesting and troublesome area. In marriage, there is a recognition of reciprocity, but sex is treated as animal, and sometimes Kant speaks of women renouncing their equal status, but not always. Women obtain domestic dominance, but no political active role. The most embarrassing view on women's nature get expressed in Kant's anthropology. He speaks of women's coquetry to attract all men for self-protection. वो कहते हैं औरतें जो हैं वो आदमियों को लुभाती रहती हैं ताकि वो उनकी रक्षा करते रहें. Strangely, this is also a view which was held by Wittgenstein, and उस पर रसल ने उनको बहुत डांट लगाई. केसी इस बात से बहुत गुस्सा होता था, but this is true. क्योंकि उनका भी ये मानना था कांट की तरीके से कि लड़कियां पढ़ने तो आती नहीं है, वो उनको पढ़ना लिखना नहीं आता. Much like many of the teachers today also say that. So he speaks of women's coquetry to attract all men for self-protection. He also warns against allowing women too much education. And Kant seems to elevate, and this I think is a very important remark by Susan Mendes, that Kant seems to elevate the practices of the 18th century to undeniable truths. Women are treated instrumentally by Kant. कि ये धारणा जो लोगों के मन में थी कि औरतें ऐसी होती हैं, इस बात को कांट स्थापित सत्य के रूप में घोषित कर रहे हैं. This is the trouble. औरतें ऐसी होती हैं, ये तो बहुत सारे लोग, अगर वो ये कहते हैं कि जमाने में ऐसा माना जा रहा है तो ठीक है. But he's saying this is the truth, and that is the trouble. Most students of philosophy consider utilitarianism as a historical ethical doctrine with many faults. And I know आप सब लोग जब utilitarianism पढ़ते हैं तो आप लोगों को ये बताया जाता है कि ये एक बहुत ही घटिया philosophical theory. क्यों घटिया माना जाता है? One is that there are three things at that, because what they're saying is that only pain and pleasure, and so Pushpin is as good as poetry. एक तो ये सवाल था, क्योंकि हालांकि बेंथम ने क्वालिटेटिव प्लेजर की बात की थी, लेकिन ये मान गए. दूसरी बात ये है कि उसमें क्वांटिटेटिव जो, क्योंकि आपने सारे लोगों का सुख को एक साथ कैलकुलेट कर लिया था, इस वजह से आपको ये पता चलेगा डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन की कोई जगह नहीं। जैसे आप ये कहें कि इस कमरे के अंतर्गत अगर हम माने कि 25 लोग हैं, तो आप ये कहें कि 25 लोगों की इनकम यहाँ पर 25 लाख रुपया है, तो आप कहें 25 लाख रुपया है और इतने कोविड हो चुका है, ये तो बड़ा अच्छी बात है। लेकिन उसके बाद फिर अगर ये माना जाए कि नहीं, 25 लाख रुपए में से 20 लाख रुपए उन लोगों के पास हैं जो सफेद कमीज पहने, तो ये पता चलेगा कि एक ये, एक वो, एक वो, एक वो, एक वो, ये आनंद जी और चौबे सर और 3 और बच्चे, इनके पास 20 लाख रुपए हैं, और बाकी सारे, तो तब आप ये कहेंगे कि ये प्रॉस्पेरस नहीं है, क्योंकि ये तो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन का सवाल है। So utilitarianism is not one. There are 2 or 3 troubles. One is that how do you calculate utility? 2, how do you add utility? 3, if the total sum is more, then you are not able to look at the questions of distribution. And then when you look at people like Chalmers and Rings and the other, they say not only do we want to experience pleasure and pain, we also want to be the actors who bring in pleasure and pain. क्योंकि उन्होंने कहा कि अगर आपके ब्रेन में हम ब्रेन इन द बैट की तरह स्टिमुलेट करके यहाँ पे लगा दें तो इलेक्ट्रोड्स, और ये कहें कि आपको पूरे टाइम सुख होता रहेगा, तो आप मान जाएंगे. Not only do you want to experience pleasure, but you want to be the agent of getting that pleasure. है ना, क्योंकि आप जब आपसे कहते थे कि हिंदुस्तान की आजादी तो अंग्रेज आपको दे के चले गए थे, तो आपको कितना गुस्सा आता है. So achieving your pleasure, achieving your pain, achieving your thing is very important. So that these are many kinds, and utilitarianism has also many other issues. But here is something which I think you need to look at very seriously with reference to women. Utilitarianism as a historical ethical doctrine has many faults, but we must be reminded of a strong epistemological appeal of that thought. One, it offered one principle of utility like Newton. कि एक प्रिंसिपल से, जैसे न्यूटन ने कहा कि एक प्रिंसिपल है उससे हम सब चीजें एक्सप्लेन कर सकते हैं फिजिकल फिनोमेना, उसी तरीके से, और वो क्या है, एक्शन रिएक्शन. यहां पर उन्होंने कहा प्लेजर एंड पेन. सेकेंडली, अ न्यू साइंस ऑफ सोसाइटी कुड बी बिल्ट अपॉन सेंसिबल एक्सपीरियंस ऑफ पेन एंड प्लेजर व्हिच वर एम्पिरिकली वेरीफाइबल. किसी को सुख हो रहा है, दुख हो रहा है, एम्पिरिकली वेरीफाइबल है. थर्ड, ethics could now introduce quantification and become like science. So here was an explanation of how choices are made and also how they should be made. And men in the Baconian model could now make moral progress, and there is a discovery scope for improvement of moral reformation. Earthly happiness now finds ethics, law, and politics. And utilitarianism was not discussing being, being, non-being like this. They were actively engaged in the political platforms of popular action. And it's interesting that they were the first people who established colleges in England where women were allowed. Before that, women were not allowed in Oxford. Even Virginia Woolf writes that she was not allowed to enter, and she says that sometimes it is better to be locked out than to be locked in. So just as the laws of gravity apply to all, so the principles of utility apply to all, including women. और ये सिंपल सा प्रिंसिपल था कि अगर आप ये कह रहे हैं ना कि क्या प्रिंसिपल है, ग्रेटेस्ट गुड ऑफ द ग्रेटेस्ट नंबर, तो अगर आपने औरतों को नहीं इंक्लूड करा तो ग्रेटेस्ट नंबर कहां से आएगा. बाय डिफॉल्ट उसमें कोई खास चैरिटी की बात नहीं थी. Similarly, so it extended itself to women, children, and slaves, and Bentham had tried to extend the system of universal benevolence. He argued that what matters for redressal should not be reason or voice, but suffering. कि जिसकी आवाज होगी उसकी बात मानी जाएगा, या जिसका जो रीजन होगा उसी को माना जाएगा, इसको ही थे. Suffering and happiness are objective units of moral science, and all utilitarians concern themselves with women. Ancient Greeks cared for pater familias, a man with family. Moderns like Locke cared only for single individuals, excluding women or subsuming their interests under men. Each one to count as one was manifest in women's equality. And Bentham thus is the father of historical feminism. He spoke in favor of women's autonomy and legal reform. Removal of barriers to women's unhappiness will augment total amount of human happiness. Now, this is one kind of thing which we need to remember about utilitarianism. It's interesting that reminiscent of Rousseau, Elizabeth Cady stated an important suffragists, however, want these moral creatures to exert their influence. यहाँ पर जो बात मैं आपके सामने एक और रखना चाहता हूँ वो ये है कि feminist discussion often contested the idea that more universal, abstract, impartial, and rational knowledge is problematic. And their own experience more closely mirrors reality. They offered an eye of more particular, concrete, partial, and emotional knowledge. Supporting a care-focused ethics, Carol Gilligan contests Freud and Kohlberg and gives a three-stage account of moral development from self-interest to others' interest to relational interest. And while some see a risk of essentialism, because अगर आप ये कहते हैं कि women are essentially caring, तो फिर बात ये होगी कि फिर आप उनको forever mothers and forever nurse बना के छोड़ देंगे, ये भी एक risk है. But Gilligan says that the contrast between care and justice is tenable, and whether we may contest that in case of conflict, impartiality is not a superior stance to a cultivated over perseveration. Women are caregivers and would perhaps keep them as forever mothers and nurses, and feminists have tried to introduce concepts like distorted and undistorted care, what we were talking about, manufactured and Sarah Roddick wants to encourage maternal thinking, which is both critical and caring. Now, it can appear that their diversity of feminist positions will perhaps bring nothing to public policy. And however, historically, it seems that modern day universalists like Anne Nice seem to draw much from the feminist movement. आप सभी लोग यहाँ पर ecological consciousness के ऊपर भी कोई काम कर रहा था, and all of you know about Anne Nice in deep ecology, and he says that he has drawn much of his inspiration from feminist consciousness, which is actually a consciousness of care and not just of power over things. He also thinks that he has drawn much from Gandhi, and he also thinks that he has drawn much from the Upanishads. And that is the very interesting thing in Anne Nice, who's actually a Norwegian philosopher and a traveler and a mountain climber. So locatedness must be appreciated, but the question is, what happens to universality? And this is the kind of thing which I actually wanted to share with you. People think that there is a fault line with traditional ethics because it shows less concern for women, interest in issues. It trivializes moral issues and its so-called private world of caring, devaluing women and as morally shallow in comparison with men, overrating so-called masculine traits like independence, autonomy, will, and domination, and underrating the culturally identified feminine characteristics like interdependence, community connection, sharing, emotion, body, trust, absence of hierarchy, process of joy and peace. So they are talking about gendered ethics, and they say that that shall ameliorate the suffering of the oppressed groups. The history of women's morality is not new. The great philosophers from Plato to Aristotle to Descartes to Kant have often spoken about women having a different and a morally inferior nature. And in Mary Wollstonecraft, you find that classic work which you all read, Vindication of the Rights of Women. She denied that women were doomed by nature to be morally less virtuous. They are deprived of opportunities to develop rational powers and wind up being hypersensitive, narcissistic, and self-indulgent. But if you will give them the right kind of education, they can be cured by rigorous education. This is Wollstonecraft. Reason is a distinguishing human characteristic which she accepts like the rest of the liberals. We need to also cultivate positive psychological states like gentleness, which is associated with women. And Mill, in the next century, spoke of only one virtue, and that is human virtue. He doesn't talk about female virtues and male virtues. Later, many thinkers denied that virtue should be same for both sexes and argued for separate but equal theory. And there have been who valorizes women's domestic role. And it may be useful to argue that that at the meta level, now, are there multi-valued logical systems? Are there pluralities in the world? And I think all of you are students of philosophy here. Apart from the feminist consciousness, you should take it to the broader question. We are all talking about pluralism. we are all talking about multiculturalism. But all of you in your, at least in your MA courses, read empiricism and read the criticism of empiricism, the two dogmas of empiricism by Quine, and then you also read Davidson's essay on the third dogma of criticism. Now, what is the third dogma of empiricism? The scheme content dichotomy. Huh. That there is a certain kind of a scheme in which people think. And then there would be, okay, then women have one scheme, men have one scheme, etc. So this also, and with that, when you read Davidson, there's another essay which I think you should also read, and that is when he questions the very idea of a conceptual scheme, he says, pluralism cannot be said, and if said, cannot be true. By pluralism, that there are views which are mutually isolated and cannot be expressed in each other's language. This cannot be said at all. Because the moment you say, then there is a way in which you can plot all of them. But if you say that there are multiple things which are incommensurable, then how are you saying that? Now, this general theory of philosophy of language about pluralism should also then be addressed to the question that men and women have incommensurable ways of looking at the world. Because this again is something which I want to say, and I'll say that in a short while, is this question. Some people are saying, and I think rightly so, because they are very tired of their movement when men and structures of power have not heard, कि औरतों की बातें तो आदमियों को समझ में नहीं आ सकती, दलितों की बातें तो अपकास्ट को समझ में नहीं आ सकती, अश्वेतों का दुख तो श्वेत लोगों को समझ में नहीं आ सकता. Now you are all young philosophers. Now all of you young philosophers have at least in their ethical theory read Immanuel Kant. And all of you, if you have read Immanuel Kant's ethical theory, you have read one thing which is very clearly and initially taught to all of you, apart from categorical imperative and the other, and that is ought implies can. Right? Ought implies can. ठीक है? तो जो आपको करने को कहा जा रहा है वो आपके लिए कितना पॉसिबल होना चाहिए, है ना? लेकिन अगर आप ये कहें कि आदमी औरतों की बातें समझ ही नहीं सकते, तो फिर वो अगर औरतों की बात नहीं समझते तो उनको आप दोषी नहीं ठहरा सकते. अगर आप ये कहें कि दलितों का दुख नॉन दलित समझ ही नहीं सकते, तो फिर आप उनको दोषी भी नहीं ठहरा सकते. अगर आप ये कहते हैं कि अश्वेतों की पीड़ा और उनके दमन के वृत्तांत श्वेत व्यक्ति सुन ही नहीं सकते, उनकी समझ में ही नहीं आ सकता, तो आप एक तरीके से उनको खुली छूट दे रहे हैं. You're absolving them of their responsibility, because then they say, what I cannot do, what I cannot understand, I cannot be expected to do. So philosophically, you should not carry this argument to an extreme, where you're saying that the voice of the woman cannot be understood by the man. The voice of the white cannot be understood by the black. The voice of the native cannot be understood. Of course, जो बात radical translation की जो थी, intranslatability thesis में, वो भी theory क्या थी? कई लोगों को जब सिर्फ मोटा-मोटा टाइटल पढ़ते हैं, theory of radical intranslatability, क्वाइन ने कहा इसका मतलब है एक स्कीम को दूसरी स्कीम में ट्रांसलेट नहीं किया, ये बिल्कुल मतलब नहीं. You cannot translate the whole scheme without residue. कुछ शेष रह जाएगा, पर ट्रांसलेट नहीं हो सकता, ये नहीं हो सकता. So that cannot be radically translated, but it can be translated. It can be translated with residue. Because if you are saying it cannot be translated at all, then you are closing doors for communication, you are closing doors for ameliorative action, you are closing doors for reform and moral progress. And therefore, I think the excitement, overexcitement of anthropological theory, also much of it which has also come because of Ludwig Wittgenstein, language game theory, different language games, different life worlds. Oh God, कितनी अजीब सी theory है ये. आप ये कहेंगे कि एक language game के अंतर्गत जो true है वो दूसरे में true नहीं है. एक form of life अपने आप में autonomous है, दूसरा form है. तो कास्टिज्म भी एक फॉर्म ऑफ लाइफ है, पेट्रियार्की भी एक फॉर्म ऑफ लाइफ है, कॉलोनियलिज्म भी एक फॉर्म ऑफ लाइफ है। जो बनारस के ठग थे उनकी भी एक थी फॉर्म ऑफ लाइफ, जिसमें वो जाते थे, देवी जी की पूजा करते थे, फिर लोगों की गर्दन काट के लाते थे, उनको फिर चढ़ाते थे, फिर वो भी फॉर्म ऑफ लाइफ है, था ना। उसके लैंग्वेज गेम भी था, उसके अंदर रूल्स भी थे, उसके अंदर वो सही था कि नहीं था? आप कहें नहीं 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 नहीं, सही गलत की चर्चा ही नहीं की जा सकती। लैंग्वेज गेम्स एंड फॉर्म्स ऑफ लाइफ आर इंडिपेंडेंट। प्लीज डोंट डू दिस. Please don't do this. This is also one paper which I wrote against Wittgenstein. That this is in fact a very terrible theory. You can't have a theory which actually excludes communication. You can't have a theory which excludes the possibility of mutual learning, growth, and internal change. So it may be all right that, as a sophisticated theory, that you have to see that, no, what are you saying? We have to be sensitive to the context, but don't over-privilege the context so as to lead to the impossibility of communication. And that, I think, is an important danger which we need to be very careful, and only philosophers can point this out to the sociologist, because the sociologist does not have these kind of philosophical background in his or her background. Now, this is what again, some things I think what I wanted to say was, many things have historical context. Like, say, for instance, the question now you're looking at about marital rape and the others. Now, marital rape हो सकता है कि नहीं हो सकता है? अब हिंदुस्तान का लॉ अभी तक उसको रिकॉग्नाइज करने में परेशान हो रहा है, क्योंकि आपका एक दूसरा लॉ है जो कहता है रेस्टोरेशन ऑफ कॉन्जुगल राइट्स। चोर को भी वो रेस्टोरेशन ऑफ कॉन्जुगल राइट्स होगा, बीवी कहीं चली गई तो उसको खींच के लाया जाएगा आदमी के पास वापस। Now, these kind of questions have traditional and modern laws regarding dissolution of marriage. In case of impotence, कि आदमी अगर impotent है तो आप शादी डिसॉल्व कर सकते हैं। ये वाली बात मॉडर्न लॉ भी अलाउ करता है और मनुस्मृति भी अलाउ करती थी। पर जब इसका उल्टा होता है तो हम लोग को तकलीफ होती है कि नहीं? बांझ कह के किसी औरत को निकाल देते हैं तो, या दूसरी शादी करते हैं तो आपको अच्छा लगता है? So the questions are that many things within their own context create a certain kind of contextual reference point which has to be debated then and there. But the larger philosophical point is that are we going back to the principles of impartiality or not? Are we going to the principles of universality? Are we now justifying somehow or the other that when philosophy takes its turn in terms of discussing being by qua being, it is not escaping reality, but taking a certain kind of a high point wherein more is visible. Vagueness, ambiguities, and silences are important parts of our communicative intersubjective space, as well as our self-reflection. But we don't leave them at that, because many people are saying that, we should not be talking about only precision. We should not be only talking about analysis. We should not be talking about a single theory of meaning, because it's also important to look at vagueness, ambiguity, and silences. Dr. Mishra has a beautiful paper on Mon. But the question is further, all Mon is not of the same kind. We have to see that what is the kind of thing that we are talking about. So what is the kind of silence that we are talking about? What is the kind of self-reflection that we are talking about? And here I would briefly like to take two things. I'm taking a lot of your time, but I really want to take two things. One is a very important book which is published by Motilal Banarsi, something like 15 years back. But it's a very, very important book. I think one of the most important books by an Indian feminist. That is my teacher, Professor Shefali Moitra. And her book is called Feminist Thought, Objectivity, and Communication. And she speaks about 3 levels of discrimination. I have rarely seen a book of such quality. She writes about 3 levels of discrimination: sexism, patriarchy, and androcentrism. And she talks about phallocentrism. And she thinks that Kant's categorical imperative and goodwill are not gender sensitive. Women are accustomed to address ethical questions in a concrete personal way, which would be considered non-rational, immature, not appropriate for ideal human being, and women often under internalize this. Now, this remark of Sheikh Alidi has a problem because I think there is an essentialization, but this is what she's saying. She then mentions Evelyn Fox Keller, Helen Longino, and all of whom are talking about sensitive, gender-sensitive sign, and they speak about gender's bias in the problem selection, on practices like exclusive emphasis on female contraception, on evolution of simple to complex, the male stream emphasis on competition and struggle with domination, and feminists speak of female gendered virtues like nurturance, tolerance, awareness of the others. The liberals who are pro-changes, but they also do not change the entire structure, and this is the criticism which Sheikh Alidi and many others make against the liberal theory, because they are only saying mend the raft as we float. Do not change the whole thing. They are not radical enough. Women's lived experience like birthing, mothering, adolescent pregnancy, pornography are not taken as philosophical issues. And when the liberal feminists subscribe to the tripartite division of man, woman, human, the question is there an ungendered facet of living experience? And liberals seem to be saying that a transcendent, that women need to transcend being a woman. And this is also very interesting, that Simone de Beauvoir also is finally saying कि औरतों को औरत होना छोड़ देना चाहिए. और यही कई बार जो संत कवियों का होता था कि आप अपनी एम्बॉडीमेंट को छोड़ दीजिए, तभी आपको मुक्ति मिलेगी. So leave alone your gendered existence. And she seems to apply Sartre's existentialism to the women's issues. And Rawls again gives, this is an accusation against Rawls very, very strongly, that he gives a gender neutral theory, and his thesis requires fairness, rationality, objectivity, and reflective equilibrium, which are all male virtues. Strawson's natural limits, Russell's unchanging instinctive beliefs, and even Professor Piquesen's writing about formal laws of logic and serious operations of reason, they are all considered to be male stream. And procedure is twofold. How do you include? दो तरीके हैं औरतों को include करके. Inclusion at universal logical level, and second is subsumption at the lower level. And them are problematic. Sainz theory is gender sensitive, but he too, according to Sheikh Alidi, is arguing for justice as fairness and taking rationality to be the maximization of utility, which is a subsumptive expansion. Hegemony of reason, Rahul's pet topic, is something, and its identification as male gendered virtue is a problem. And women are considered to be emotional, which is resistant to computation and order. Skepticism about ideals of rationality, universality, impersonality, detachment, dispassion, neutrality have been expressed by pragmatists, historicists, Wittgensteinians and others. तो केवल feminists नहीं हैं जो rationality, universality की मुखालफत कर रहे हैं. Phenomenologists भी कह रहे थे, existentialists भी कह रहे थे. But feminists are saying that these are politically motivated, not just mistaken. Because the other people were saying that they are mistaken. And some feminists like to project science requires some repair work, and they will use the Marxist existential Freudian models. The radical insist that all investigative apparatus needs correction. Many things have to be said here, but let me take one point, which I think is very interesting. That sexist remarks about philosophers from Plato to Wittgenstein are amply documented, and women's lived experience is not taken with it. Now, the two questions that we are asking is there a gender neutral core in philosophy? And two, is gender a ubiquitous category which has to be admitted? So should we admit gender as a philosophical category? One, or we can say that philosophy is gender neutral. Now, interesting thing is that gender oppression, unlike class, caste, and race, involves a dimension of intimacy that touches both the perpetrator and the victim. And this is, in fact, the most difficult part about gender. जो आप देखते हैं कि Marxist revolution में भी है, workers of the world unite, You have nothing to lose but your chains. आपका क्या है, जो मालिक है वो आपका दुश्मन है. आपको फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन की तरीके से आप उसकी गर्दन भी काट देंगे तो भी आपको कोई तकलीफ नहीं होगी. But in case of women, who's the enemy? The father, the brother, the son, the lover. So the intimacy of relationship is so difficult, and that is why when you look at or any biography of women struggling in their lives, you read the Tehmina Durrani's account from Pakistan or the other. बार-बार वो औरतें पिट रही हैं, फिर चली जा रही हैं, फिर पिट रही हैं, फिर चली आ रही हैं. नहीं नहीं बेटा है वो मान जाएगा, कभी तो ही हो जाता है, शराब पी के आया था, etc etc. Because the call of justice and the call of love are in conflict. It becomes so difficult because it's not between two principles of justice, but the call of the heart and the mind. And therefore, the intimacy of the opposition in case of the gender-based violence is very, very difficult to overcome. And that is the peculiarity of gender oppression. In a project of empowerment, Professor Mehta recommends strengthening as power is always associated with domination. And then she gives this model that, you know, when we think about power, we also only think of power in terms of power over, not power with, not power within, or not power alongside. So the model of power also needs to be changed, and transformation of the model of power from hierarchical to sharing order can be sustained by remodeling of personal relationships. And these are the kinds of things which people are talking about. Kant, Davidson, Sen believe that reason's function is to have coherent, systematic understanding of experience. But feminists are arguing that this characterization of logic, rationality, philosophy is based upon dualism. Privileging of reason over emotion is a political game. And here let me quote something which is very interesting. Val Plumwood refers to the totalitarian politics of logic. She says, logic is a cultural artifact, passes off as natural. Too valued logic is that of domination. And she speaks how totalitarian politics can play havoc with logic's claim for egalitarianism. Now, this may seem very curious कि logic के बारे में egalitarian और non-egalitarian कहीं category mistake तो नहीं है. But she says that, and she says, when you use the category of negation, she says, not P is defined in terms of P, becomes peripheral, and P becomes center of power, and P is male and not P is female. And this is, in fact, to my mind, a very strange kind of anthropocentrism. And what are they worried about? वो बार-बार example ये देते हैं. आप लोग logic में पहली class से लेके आखिरी class तक example देते हैं. All men are mortal. Socrates is so Socrates is mortal. But one woman was very intelligent. She said, no, but why should you be worried about that? It means that women are immortal. But this is, we are laughing at it. The question is not about that. The question is that, you know, repeatedly, even in examples, we never consider, like, even if you look at, I was doing the study with the classroom studies in maths. From class 1 to class 5, whenever there will be an example of somebody going to sell something, Mohan gaye bechne gaya, Ramu gaye bechne gaya. So, always would be that it's a representation of the man in the marketplace and the woman in the domestic space, which is actually not untrue, but it is actually a reinforcement of a certain truth which needs transformation. So it's not a matter of being true or untrue, being true to reality and not true to reality. We are saying that, you know, we also want one to recognize that it is not always Mohan who goes and sells, but so you recognize women's labor in the private and the public domain, but also that some changes which have to be deliberately done and need to be transformed. That is the kind of thing which we're in. Now, laws of thought were challenged by mystics, romantics, pragmatists, and anti-foundationalists, and feminists are not the only one. Dualism or objectification are problematic, though sometimes held to be beneficial. Homogenization and stereotyping is also problematic. Difference cannot be denied, but homogenization and instrumentalization are taken as motivated. Plurality of logical systems, as I said, for some purposes is classified by some classical and some by non-classical logic. But can we have a monologic at the basic level like Davidson and Sen. So again, it seems to be homogenizing. So do we become anarchists? But Moitra says you need to go plural and radical. Is it possible for us to give new meanings to old concepts and to read society in language as an oversimplification? And this I must share with you a very interesting experience. I had for a very long time, as I was mentioned in my data, I'd worked with communities on gender justice. And so one of the things that we were trying to do is to look at textbooks that exist in Uttar Pradesh. And we were trying to see the gender bias in that. How many pictures of boys, how many pictures of girls, what are girls shown doing, what are boys shown doing. And from class 1 to class 5, the mention of girls becomes less and less. Where women are only doing domestic chores, men are doing external work, and the description becomes less and less of men. We submitted that report to the government of Uttar Pradesh, and fortunately the government of Uttar Pradesh took cognizance of that, and subsequently now when you look at the books, there are changes. Like now you see कि वो पापा भी बच्ची को नहला रहा है एक फोटो में, माँ भी बच्चे का होमवर्क करा रही है, और कल्पना चावला इन सब पे lessons आ गए. Many things can change. But when we were doing this and we were looking at gender bias and saying that, हमेशा ही होता है कि वो मेरा लाल पैदा हुआ, there's nothing like मेरी लाली पैदा हुई. All language from folk traditions to the other. There's no sohar, no dholak on birth of a daughter, and so we tried and created that in Rajasthan and also in UP. Godh bitiya khilaye to bada maza hai. But very difficult to find those things in tradition. Ram Lala and Krishna Lala and no Lali. So the questions were, we were raising these questions, and I remember 3 years back before COVID, Gayatri Chakravarti came to Delhi at IIC, and she was reading a paper on the necessity and impossibility of translation. So one of the young people, like he was even much younger than me, so he said, oh, no, we need to do gender bias and all of that. But then she had a very interesting thing. Is there somebody who is from Bengal over here? No Bengali in Banaras? What a shame. Yeah. So she said, in Bangla, you do not have a gender. The gender doesn't, the verb does not take the gender declination. So, ladka bhi khata hai aur ladki bhi khata hai. So we laugh at that, but she says that since there is no gender declination and no gender bias in Bangla language, from that to imagine that Bengalis are not gender biased will be a mistake, and anybody who believes that should go and boil his head. So, though it is a fact that language sometimes reinforces gender stereotyping and gender biases, to imagine where language does not exhibit gender bias, the society does not exhibit gender bias, will be an oversimplification. So the question is that what does philosophy do then? How does philosophy look at language? How does philosophy look at reality? And how does philosophical attempt look at that? Like say for instance, and this is again what I keep on saying, that representations in public and our values are not the same. All of us in our houses have a Radha Krishna in our puja. But Radha Krishna are not married to each other. Will you allow unmarried people to get their photographs and keep in your house? You won't. So the way we have the gods is not the way we accept in our own lives. So simple linguistic representation, pictorial representation, religious representation, from that you cannot jump to large-scale social generalizations. Philosophical attempts, again, have been made. Some people have done looking at the 3 notions of negation in Nyaya, and they say that there is a tolerant notion of negation and there is a explicit notion of contradiction and the others, and maybe we can weaken the notion of negation and then maybe we'll become feminists. But a priorism of philosophical method and abstraction leading to some general features still seems to me more useful for the purposes of feminist struggle, both which aspire for undifferentiated equality or ones which speak of equality with differences. The caveat is that identities with difference are negotiated, debated, and dynamic. Aristotle's emphasis on taking law of excluded middle and law of contradiction as basic is in no way stops him from further discussing being and becoming, actuality and potentiality. Gender fluidity does not necessitate foregoing certain minimal understanding of universal positions. And that is the kind of thing which I am wanting to say. One of the things which I wanted to call your attention to was the standpoint theory. Uh, and before that, a very small account on multiculturalism. There is a very interesting article which you all must read, which is called "Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women?" And Susan Oken had written this a very, very long back. And now you know that it's a very important debate, and philosophers should not be frightened of that. What is the debate which is happening very hotly everywhere in the world? It's the question of hijab. So in France, there was a huge amount of trouble. Should women wear the hijab or not? And we know that there are different kinds of arguments which are coming. One, people are saying that it is anti-feminist because hijab is a sign of women's subordination and it is a sign of mobile segregation. And I remember my friend Rakshanda from Pakistan, she had to fight a legal case in the court against Yahya Khan at that time, no, Ziaul Haq. Because when she became a lawyer, she said कि आप कोर्ट में नहीं आ सकती, आपको चादर ओढ़ के आना पड़ेगा. She said कि मैं तो वकील बनी ही इसलिए थी कि मैं ये काला कोट पहन के आऊंगी. So she had to fight. And then इतना बड़ा सा एक लकड़ी का डिब्बा बनाया गया, उसमें एक होल बनाया गया, and she was allowed to come with a black coat and stand behind that. So that's the kind of thing, because they were fighting against wearing a chadar and the others, because she as a feminist thought of that. On the other hand, there is the other question that, women have a right to choose what they want to wear. And you are nobody to tell them कि मैं hijab पहनूंगी कि नहीं पहनूंगी. So the questions are about the feminist stand as well as the cultural religious identity, and the third question is about woman's identity, what to wear and not to wear. Some of the women are also saying that actually hijab is like wearing a makeup. सारी औरतों को, आप सफेद औरतें भी तो अपने आप मेकअप करती हैं ताकि वो आदमी उनसे जो कहते हैं वो वैसी बनना चाहती हैं. क्योंकि आप ये कह रहे हैं कि अंग्रेज आदमी चाहता है कि लड़कियों की टांगें दिखाई दें तो वो छोटी निकर पहनती हैं, हिंदुस्तानी आदमी चाहता है कि औरतों की कमर दिखाई दे तो वो साड़ी पहनती हैं, और पाकिस्तानी आदमी कहता है कि उनकी सिर्फ आंखें दिखाई दें तो वो हिजाब पहन रही. पर औरतें क्या चाहती हैं ये तो किसी ने भी नहीं पूछा. ये तो सब आदमी तय कर रहे हैं. हिंदुस्तान का आदमी कह रहा है, यूपी का आदमी कह रहा है साड़ी पहनना बहुत अच्छी बात है, उसमें कमर दिखाई दे रही है. पंजाब में जब जाते हैं ये तो बड़ी बदतमीज औरत है, ये साड़ी पहन के क्यों आ गई, उसको तो सलवार पहननी चाहिए, उसका पूरा बदन कवर रहना चाहिए. So all sorts of things are, but they are all, this conversation is being determined by what men want to see and do not want to see. Now, in this whole question, the question is that does the recognition of multiculturals, कि सब cultures को अपने अपने cultures को determine करना, is it good for women or not good for women? And Susan Oken has this to say that no, multiculturalism is bad for women. हालांकि ज्यादातर आप ये देखते हैं कि तमाम दुनिया का डिबेट ये है कि मल्टीकल्चरलिज्म इज समथिंग वेरी गुड. So whether it is Bhikkhu Parekh or Ashish Nandi or everybody is saying, but Oken has this to say that majority of the world cultures are patriarchal, and the liberal policies that protect minorities typically entrench gender hierarchies, and individual rights of equality must be normatively prior to the group rights of the cultural determination. And therefore, Oken's universalism has predictably been dubbed as privileging Western liberal priorities. And this is the kind of thing which you all see has been also said about Amartya Sen, and especially about Mahata Nussbaum, that you are actually, what Rahul also has a trouble with, that human rights as Western hegemonic rights, which Zizek is fighting against. There are many, many articles which I have mentioned here, which I think when I give you a written text, I'll give them to you. The multicultural apologists, like those worrying about religious pluralism, have a range of questions to address. The pluralist position envisaged in the position where all considerations of truth, value, and dialogue have been internalized. So truth will be determined by the community, values will be determined by the community, and dialogue will also happen only within the community. कि मुसलमान लोगों का बारे में सिर्फ मुसलमान लोग तय करेंगे, हिंदू लोगों के बारे में सिर्फ हिंदू लोग तय करेंगे. क्यों? ये सही है? सही है? So how do you then decide that, this is only the, because this is again a very troublesome thing, and this is what I said earlier, because you are then denying the possibility of common minimal humanity and common human, because they were saying, no, 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 only the blacks will decide what is to be done to them. Only the whites will decide what will happen to them. Only the women will decide what has happened to them. Now, sometimes it may be a useful thing to say, like when Vivekananda says कि सतीदाह प्रथा हो रहा था, बाल विवाह हो रहा था, उन्होंने कहा तुम औरत हो जो तुम उनके बारे में कहोगे, चुप रहो. Or sometimes it may be an all right thing, but you cannot philosophically make it a rule that only the member of a particular group will have the exclusive right to determine truth, values, and dialogue within that particular group, or else it becomes very, very troublesome. And this, I think, is the difficulty with multiculturalism, and this is also a difficulty with the kind of things which are brought forward by many people, including William Deman. There's Not to Fade Away, Restoring Civil Identity Among the Young. This is one. Bhikkhu Parekh has an interesting thing. And this is, in fact, a very good book which you should all read. It is called Rethinking Multiculturalism, where Bhikkhu Parekh has been arguing about a distinction between multiculturalism and multiculturalist, two kind of multicultural and multiculturalist. I am taking a lot of your time, but let me come to one small point which I want you to address. There's a very interesting book which came in 2009 by Monica Mukherjee, which is called Women's Rights and Multicultural Claims, where again she talks about serialized identities, that we have many identities. So I'm a brother, I'm a son, I'm a teacher, I'm a member of the teaching community, I am maybe a bird watcher, I may be an Indian, I may be a world citizen. Now, which is my identity, which is my principal identity? Many people say that when threatened, some identities become privileged. Say, for instance, during the colonial times, when we were colonized by the British, the Indian identity had become the overriding identity during the nationalist movement. Right now, when there is the global market of transnational corporations, then we are talking about our own economic sovereignty and trying to talk about it. So economic threatening of the Indian identity rather than the political one has now taken the front seat. So on certain other occasions, it may not be the case. And you know the big debate which had happened, or which is generally presented between Gandhi and Tagore about nationalism. And Tagore then is against a certain kind of aggressive nationalism. But to say that Tagore is anti-nationalist will be not true. He's not anti-nationalist, but he is against a certain kind of model of aggressive nationalism. Now, in this identity of conception of good, conception of truth, are we all going to relativize them to things? And three questions could be raised. One, practical, how do we engage with the gendered question? The second is that can we have a moral theory without a metaphysical theory? And then there is the third question, that metaphilosophically, when you say that there are multiple standpoints, are we going to accept all the multiple standpoints or not? The standpoint theory is actually a theory which actually has a Marxist history. The Marxist story is that the poorest people are more likely, and the most disadvantaged people are the most likely to have the most objective view, because they will understand the plight and the difficulty of all others. Therefore, the view of the proletariat should be privileged. The standpoint theory, as used by the feminists, also uses the same argument. Since women are the most marginal, therefore, and this they have seen across classes, कि जो ऊंचे घराने की रानी भी है, वो भी अपने घर की नौकरानी के साथ औरत होने के दुख को एक समान अनुभव कर सकती है. तो उसका पति कहता है कि तुम्हारा लड़का क्यों नहीं हुआ, तुम्हारा रंग गोरा नहीं है, तुम खाना अच्छा नहीं बनाती हो. So at one level, women across the board are like a caste. And Therefore, they say that women's perspective as a standpoint of the most oppressed and the marginalized should be privileged because they are more likely than the other to give you the objective standard from the other. This is the standpoint theory. And again here, I have a very long paper, but I'm not going to. In that, again, I am raising the two questions. One, I think it is factually incorrect. Not all women are the same. Not all women are kind and caring. Not all women think kindly about other women. And women are as ruthless, as ambitious, as terrible as anybody else. I remember when I used to do these trainings for IAS and PCS officers, at one time we were doing on gender stereotyping, and they were said, oh, लड़कियां कैसी होती हैं? तो सबने कहा, oh, लड़कियां gentle होती हैं, मृदुभाषी होती हैं, अच्छा बोलती हैं, etc. etc. आदमी कैसे होते हैं? Assertive होते हैं, aggressive, etc. And we were sitting in the PCS academy, and behind us there was the picture of the chief minister of the state and the prime minister. And at that time, the chief minister happened to be the Honorable Sushri Mayawati ji, and the prime minister used to be the Honorable Dr. Manmohan Singh. So I said, who's more assertive, who's more aggressive? Kaun adhik mridubhashi hai, kaun emotional hai? They said, no, but this is an exception. The point is not of an exception. The point, you can't essentialize. We have seen that in elections, that whether it comes to corruption, whether it is coming to sharab dekar election jeetna, paise dekar election jeetna, the Maharashtra Panchayat elections or anywhere else, whether it's a man or a woman, the game is now being played with that. So whether it's a woman doing that, so when you had Gandhi ji, you had Sucheta Kriplani, when you have Mulayam Singh, you have Mayawati. So you have the game, the rules of the game have changed. And so the member of the gendered class is making no difference. And therefore it's important for us to see that how far will we go into looking at the standpoint theory and say, so Alexandra Tanaseni said, seems to conflate that, she said that, you know, feminist, she's saying this Alexandra Tanaseni, this is a 99 essay, it's called An Introduction to Feminist Epistemologies. And she says, all women, all feminists, and very quickly, all women, have distinctive outlook because their experiences are different from others who occupy other positions in society. But here, she happily seems to conflate all women as feminists and all feminists as women. And she explains the importance of a standpoint of her. She explains this feminist or womanly perspective, furthermore, is not merely different from, say, the masculine perspective, but it is a privileged perspective. And scholars from the feminist persuasion have called attention to how gender, power, and knowledge are together. And this is, they are saying that there is sexist remarks made by that, and apart from Russell and Mill, that we have seen again and again. Aristotle said that absence of leisure creates that. But the feminist standpoint theory, according to Tanaseni, finds its ancestors in the Marxist notion of the standpoint of the proletariat. And as I mentioned, according to Marx, the positions occupied in society by different classes gives them different perspectives on social reality. And standpoint of the working class is less distorted than those offered by the other people. Now, this again countered by two people against Marx, both of whom we should remember. One is Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies, and the other is Hannah Arendt. She says कि सारे गरीब मार्क्सिस्ट होते हैं, ये आपका भ्रम है. सारे गरीब दलितों को और अपवंचितों को समान बनाना चाहते हैं, ये आपका भ्रम है. बहुत सारे गरीब अमीर बनना चाहते हैं और दूसरों का शोषण करना चाहते हैं. So you cannot identify the poor necessarily with the subversive. So it is factually incorrect that all women are kind, caring, and think about the others. And the second, as I said, that if you will essentialize this, the feminist transformation of the state is again, will then make it impossible for you to change the reality. Tanaseni, like many others, holds that we cannot ever step outside ourselves and we can never achieve a view from nowhere. What we can achieve instead is a perspectival knowledge connected to immediate practical occurrences. And one may recall here, as I said, that Kant had attempted to identify the general features of our experience which were not part of object but not of individual subjective sense. There is no knowledge of a thing in itself, but there is an objective condition of experience. So it's not that individual experiences will be different. And this, I think, is a problem with some of the phenomenological reading of Kant. These features of knowledge are, however, too general and do not include the specificities of experience. So what individual women will do will not be taken care of it. And situated knowledge, what Donna Haraway and the others are not being taken. Tanasiri thinks that trying to gain practical mastery over environment is not always a form of domination. And then she talks about a romantic view of nature. And this is interesting discussion in relation to subject and object, where Nancy Keller and the others are also doing that. My point is simple. It is true that objectivity has been traditionally associated with an unemotional way of reasoning, which is often considered masculine. And this has been associated with the subject-object split of the Cartesian Enlightenment. But I am very unsure of both the scholarly accuracy that Descartes did that. I can show that he did not do that. And some scholars suggest that objectivity in science should not be identified with a view from nowhere, but should be taken as an approximation arrived through intersubjective discussion. So what we were discussing, Rahul, that we will never get objectively outside our skin, but nonetheless as far as we can in terms of intersubjective. So now the notion of reality as constructed does not completely cancel out the idea of objectivity. So it is constructed, but it is not an idealist function of the will. I cannot create it by an act of will. The pragmatist theory has enough philosophical heritage to demonstrate this, and that there is an ethical dimension of knowledge is supposed to be forgotten by those who argue for a view from nowhere. This may, however, not be true. It may be that the contingencies of opinions and speciality of specifically dominant oppressive ones are being avoided by this aspirational view from nowhere. Scientists from Galileo to rationalists like Dabolkar in Pune have been killed by emotional ideological perspectivals and power. So scientists have not killed each other. How do we examine scientific locations of researchers, and how do we order of preference? Sandra Harding argues that objectivity is to be increased if we take the location of the marginalized people as standpoints for scientific inquiry. Many philosophers and philosophies have fairly modest self-understanding of their task. Many seek abstraction to find scope for inclusive dialogue. Hegemonic discourse of cultural specificities have always and will always be problematic. Early classes of logic try to explain difference between logical relations and informal accusations. So argumentum ad hominem and the liar's paradox, etc. So calling somebody a prostitute, a loose woman, or an uneducated woman would be a logical fallacy of argumentum ad hominem. But strangely, contextualism is brought as well. Kripke, Plattinger, and even Hilary Putnam seem to entertain the question of a priori for whom. So that is the kind of question that we have sometimes to take. And what I am saying that the cultural identities which are sources of humiliation are often used as weapons of subversion. But there still is a scope for some people to understand histories of oppression through such markers of identity and bonds of struggle for platforms of such identity, but may claim to recognize with or without their identities. And we may still want to have a choice, like Bulle Shah said, "Chal Bulleya, chal utthe jaiye, jinne sare anne, na koi saadi jaat pehchane, na koi sanu manne." Oh Bulle, let us rise up and go to a place where everybody is blind and nobody knows who my caste is, what my caste is, and what is my position of honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for a really fascinating and thought-provoking presentation and speaking at length.